The black sedan pulled up to the front of the Helix Global Tower just before 7 in the morning. Its engine purred softly against the hum of early Manhattan traffic. Inside the back seat, Claire Monroe sat scrolling through her phone, her manicured fingers flicking past unread emails. She had been awake since 5, prepping for what was supposed to be the most important business trip of her career. At 42, Claire was the youngest CEO in her company's history. She was known for her sharp suits, sharper wit, and a reputation that left little room for kindness. She had built her career on control of her schedule, her team, and the people around her. When the driver opened the back door, she barely glanced up from her phone. "So you're 2 minutes late," she said, her tone clipped. The man standing by the door was tall and composed, dressed neatly in a grey driver's uniform. His name tag read Daniel. His dark skin contrasted against the crisp white of his shirt. "Apologies, Mom," he said calmly. "There was construction on Madison Avenue," Claire sighed. "There's always construction somewhere. Let's go." She slid into the back seat, setting her leather bag beside her. Daniel closed the door quietly, walked around to the driver's seat, and eased the car into traffic. For the first few minutes, silence filled the car, except for the faint jazz music playing from the radio, low, unobtrusive, but steady. Claire opened her laptop, already typing, and didn't bother looking up. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror once, studying the reflection of the woman who hadn't once looked at him directly. He'd driven plenty of executives before, most polite, some cold, a few condescending. But this one was different. Her focus was absolute, her patience non-existent. "Route to JFK?" he asked, his tone respectful. "Yes," she replied without looking up. "And please, no talking." "I need to work," he nodded once. "Of course." They drove in silence for half an hour before Claire's phone buzzed. She answered sharply. "Yes?" "No, that's not acceptable. We need confirmation by noon or the Singapore boardwalks. I don't care what the Tokyo team said, get it done." Daniel's eyes flickered toward the mirror again. Her tone was sharp enough to cut through the calm morning air. When she hung up, she exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "People these days can't handle pressure." Daniel said nothing. He focused on the road, his posture straight, his hands steady. 15 minutes later, traffic slowed to a crawl near the Midtown Tunnel. Claire groaned and looked up. "How long is this going to take?" "About 15 minutes, ma'am," Daniel said. "There's an accident up ahead. But we'll still reach JFK on time." Claire huffed and leaned back. "Next time, take the express route." "Yes, ma'am." He didn't react beyond that. His voice carried neither irritation nor submission, just a simple professionalism that seemed to irritate her more than apology ever could. Finally, she said, "You've been with the company long." "Almost 4 years," he said. "Driving executives like me." "Yes," she raised an eyebrow. "Must be interesting. Hearing all our phone calls, seeing all our little meltdowns." He smiled faintly. "I try not to listen. People have a right to their space, even in close quarters." Her gaze lingered on him for the first time. His accent was smooth, neutral, hard to place. There was something calm about his voice that didn't fit the role she had assigned him in her mind. "Where are you from, Daniel?" she asked casually, more to pass the time than out of interest. He hesitated a moment. "Born in Ghana. Lived in several countries since then." She nodded slightly. "And you chose driving?" "I chose stability," he said simply. "It lets me work quietly, meet people, and keep perspective." She smirked. "Perspective doesn't usually come from sitting behind a wheel." "Depends on how you see the road," he said with a small smile. She stared at him, slightly amused despite herself. "You sound like a philosopher." "I've been called worse," he replied lightly. Her lips twitched in what might have been the faintest hint of a smile, but she quickly returned her gaze to the window. "Well, as long as you get me to Singapore on time, I don't care if you quote poetry." When they reached JFK, Daniel stepped out and opened her door with practiced precision. She gathered her things without looking up. "Thank you," she said briskly. "I'll need you on standby for the return flight." "Of course," he said. "Safe travels, Ms. Monroe." She nodded and walked off without another word. As she disappeared into the terminal, Daniel leaned back against the car for a moment, watching the crowds move. He had seen all kinds of people in his life, the humble, the cruel, the powerful, and the invisible. Claire Monroe was somewhere between the last two. He adjusted his jacket, got back in the car, and quietly switched the radio to a foreign news channel. The announcer spoke rapid French and Daniel listened, understanding every word. 3 days later, he would understand something else too. That sometimes life has a strange way of bringing people to their lessons through coincidence, not force. When Claire's plane landed in Geneva, she stepped off into a storm she hadn't seen coming. Her billion-dollar acquisition deal, a merger between Helix Global and a Swiss tech company, was already unraveling. A miscommunication had caused delays in their international proposal, and worse, the interpreters they had hired weren't yet on site. By the time she reached the hotel for the first negotiation meeting, tensions were high. Her team fumbled through greetings, translators struggled with accents, and Claire's composure began to crack. She didn't know yet that the man she'd dismissed as just a driver would soon walk into that same room, quietly, unexpectedly, and with 9 languages in his mind that would save her from losing everything she'd built. The morning of the meeting in Geneva began with a kind of tension that even the view of the lake couldn't soften. Claire sat in the corner of a sleek conference room, surrounded by her team, her tablet open to a dozen unread emails. She looked perfect on the surface, black blazer, hair pinned neatly, posture unshakable, but her mind was anything but calm. The Swiss delegation had already arrived. Their lead negotiator, a man named Lucas Bieri, was polite but firm. His English was passable, though his colleagues spoke mostly German and French. The Helix team's translators were running late due to a cancelled train. Every minute of delay cost her credibility. "We can start the introductions," Claire said, forcing composure. "They'll arrive shortly." Bieri nodded, but his colleagues exchanged glances. They murmured among themselves, the words flowing too quickly for Claire to catch. She caught fragments, délais, problèmes, chiffres, but not enough to piece together their tone. Her assistant leaned close. "Should we wait for the interpreters?" "No," she whispered. "Waiting makes us look weak," they began. Claire opened the presentation on her tablet and launched into her prepared speech. It was concise, assertive, full of the polished corporate phrasing she'd mastered over 2 decades. But as she spoke, she could sense the subtle distance across the table, the quiet exchanges, the polite nods masking confusion. When she finished, Lucas spoke in slow English. "Thank you, Ms. Monroe. We appreciate your clarity, but our board needs certain assurances on intellectual property protections. Some details in your proposal are, how do you say, unclear?" Claire smiled tightly. "Of course. We can clarify anything you'd like." He nodded, turning to his colleagues, and began translating her statement in German. Within seconds, the conversation around him grew louder, faster. A younger woman beside him switched to French to explain a technical point to another member. Words layered over one another, filling the room with multilingual noise. Claire sat still, trying to follow, but it was like listening through glass. Her heart sank. Then the door opened quietly. A hotel staff member entered, a tall, familiar figure in a crisp uniform. For a moment, she didn't register who it was. Then Daniel looked up and their eyes met. "Mr. Bieri," Daniel said politely, his voice steady. "Apologies for the interruption. The conference center sent me to confirm your catering details." Bieri nodded, responding in French. "Ah, yes, merci. C'est bien organisé." To Claire's surprise, Daniel replied fluently. "De rien, monsieur. Nous avons prévu un service discret, sans interruption." The Swiss team smiled, visibly relaxed. They laughed softly at something he said next, something Claire couldn't catch. She watched, frozen, as her driver navigated the exchange effortlessly. Then Bieri turned to her and said in English, "Your assistant speaks French too?" Before Claire could answer, Daniel said calmly, "I apologize, sir, but I'm not her assistant. I'm part of the event staff today. Would you like me to stay to assist with translation until your interpreters arrive?" Bieri looked relieved. "Yes, please. That would help very much." Claire's team looked at her in confusion. She gave a small nod, unsure what else to do. Daniel took a seat slightly behind her, notebook in hand. As the meeting continued, something extraordinary unfolded. When Bieri's team slipped back into German, Daniel translated quietly into clear English. When Claire's legal director answered in English, Daniel relayed the nuance into flawless French. His voice never wavered. His tone stayed neutral and composed. Within minutes, the chaos that had clouded the room began to clear. The discussion turned precise. Questions flowed smoothly. Even Lucas leaned forward now, visibly engaged. At one point, when two Swiss board members began debating a clause too quickly for anyone to follow, Daniel stepped in, not to interrupt, but to clarify. "They're discussing the patent clause, Ms. Munro," he said quietly. "One is concerned about third-party licensing rights. The other believes your current structure already addresses that." Claire blinked. "How do you know that?" "I studied international law for a few years before," he said softly. "Languages were part of that training." She looked at him, speechless. "You studied law?" He gave a slight nod but didn't elaborate. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, every major point had been clarified, and the Swiss delegation agreed to continue negotiations the next day. When they left the room, Bierry shook Daniel's hand first. "Impressive work," Bierry said. "You made a complicated discussion easy." Daniel smiled. "Thank you, sir." After they left, the room fell silent. Claire's team turned toward her, waiting for her reaction. She was still staring at Daniel, processing everything she'd just witnessed. "How many languages do you speak?" she asked quietly. He paused. 9, fluently. 10 if you count Akan, though I'm a bit rusty." Her assistant's mouth fell open. 9? Daniel nodded modestly. "Some came from travel, some from study. It just happened over time." Claire sat down slowly, the weight of her earlier arrogance pressing against her chest. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "You never asked," he said gently. She looked at him for a long moment, then stood. "Come with me tomorrow," she said finally. "You're sitting in on the next session." He hesitated. "Ma'am, that's not really... That's an order," she said, though her voice wasn't sharp this time. "And thank you." He inclined his head. "You're welcome." That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She replayed the meeting again and again in her head. Not the corporate talk or the figures, but the moment she'd realized how much she had underestimated him. She thought about how easily she had dismissed him on that first morning, the way she hadn't even looked at him as a person, and she thought about how in that conference room, surrounded by confusion and tension, the calm, respectful voice of the man she once ignored had saved her from collapse. The next morning, Daniel arrived early, dressed in the same neat uniform. Claire was already waiting in the hotel lobby, a coffee in hand. When she saw him, she smiled, a small, genuine smile this time. "Morning," she said. "Good morning, Miss Munro. Ready to save my company again?" He smiled faintly. "I'll do what I can." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You make it sound easy." "It's easier when people listen," he said, and for the first time she did. The second day of negotiations began earlier than expected. The sky above Geneva was a muted grey, and rain streaked across the hotel windows as Claire and her team gathered in the conference suite. Everyone was on edge but trying to hide it. The previous day had ended in an uneasy truce. Today they needed a breakthrough. Daniel arrived on time, carrying only a small notebook. He moved with quiet confidence, greeting each person in their language. A soft bonjour here, a guten morgen there, and even a brief exchange in Italian that made the Swiss delegates smile. His presence calmed the room before the meeting even began. Claire noticed it immediately. The air that had once felt heavy and competitive now felt cooperative. She caught herself watching him as he took his seat beside her, listening as he translated each nuance with effortless precision. Every time she started to answer a question, Daniel added a quiet clarification that smoothed out her phrasing or caught a subtle shift in tone. His voice was calm, respectful, never overstepping. He wasn't just translating words. He was translating trust. When one of the Swiss lawyers raised a concern about cultural perception in East Asian markets, Daniel spoke softly in French to clarify, then turned to Claire. "He's saying that the phrasing in our materials might seem too assertive in Japan and Korea. They value humility more than dominance." Claire nodded, adjusting her tone. "Thank you," she said, then addressed the issue exactly as he advised. The reaction was immediate. The Swiss team nodded approvingly. As the morning continued, Daniel's influence became undeniable. He didn't just speak. He understood. He bridged not just languages but mindsets. He noticed when the Swiss investors were growing uncomfortable and adjusted his explanations with warmth and patience. At one point, Lucas leaned back in his chair, impressed. "I must say, Miss Munro, your interpreter is remarkable," Claire smiled. He's not officially on staff, she said, but I think that's going to change. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, modest as ever. I'm happy to help, sir. This project is too important to fail. When the meeting broke for lunch, Claire and Daniel found themselves alone in the corridor. For a moment, the tension that had defined their early encounters felt like it belonged to another lifetime. She turned to him. You're not just talented. You're extraordinary. He smiled gently. I wouldn't say that. I just paid attention to the world when it spoke to me. Claire tilted her head. You speak 9 languages. You studied law. And you're driving cars for executives who don't even look at you. Why? He thought for a moment. Because I learned that knowledge means little without humility. I've had opportunities before, but I lost them when I let pride decide my path. Driving reminded me to stay grounded. Her eyes softened. That's ironic. You're probably more grounded than most people I know. He gave a small laugh. Including you? She smiled. Especially me. They both laughed lightly, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a business exchange. It felt human. 2 people from different worlds recognizing something familiar in each other. The afternoon session resumed, and this time the energy was entirely different. The Swiss team was engaged and optimistic. The document drafts began to align, the tone of conversation warmed, and even the most skeptical board members seemed to lean forward instead of crossing their arms. At one point, Lucas leaned toward Daniel and asked a question in Swiss German, a dialect so thick that even native speakers sometimes struggled with it. Without hesitation, Daniel responded perfectly, his tone respectful and steady. The room burst into quiet laughter, impressed. Claire looked at him with astonishment. How do you even know that dialect? Daniel smiled. I spent 2 years in Zurich studying interpretation work. I didn't master it then, but I picked it up later from friends. Friends? She asked. People you meet when you stop talking and start listening, he said simply. That line stayed with her for the rest of the day. When the session finally ended, Lucas approached Claire and extended his hand. I believe we are ready to move forward, he said. We just need the legal documentation finalized, and we can sign by the end of the week. Claire shook his hand firmly, a wave of relief crossing her face. You have no idea how much that means, he smiled. Actually, I think your interpreter does. That evening, back at the hotel, Claire sat on the terrace overlooking Lake Geneva, a notebook in her lap, and a cup of tea untouched beside her. The deal had been saved. The merger that could have collapsed in chaos was now on solid ground. And all because of a man she had once dismissed without a second thought. She heard footsteps behind her. Daniel approached quietly, holding a folder. I reviewed some of the contract clauses. There's a section in the Swiss agreement that uses older legal phrasing. It could cause confusion later. Claire blinked. You reviewed the contract? He nodded. You said you needed clarity. I thought it might help. She opened the folder and skimmed the pages. He was right. He'd caught details even her legal team had missed. Daniel, she said slowly, you don't just understand languages. You understand people. That's rarer than genius. He smiled, looking out over the water. People aren't that hard to understand once you stop ranking them. She fell quiet, absorbing the weight of that. For years she had measured people by title, by usefulness, by their ability to keep up. But sitting beside him now, she realized how narrow her definition of success had been. After a long pause, she said softly, You ever miss practicing law? He thought for a moment. Sometimes. But life isn't always about getting back to what you were. Sometimes it's about finding peace in who you became. She nodded slowly. You should teach that at business schools, he smiled. I think you're doing just fine learning it here. They both laughed, quietly, genuinely. The next morning, Claire called her assistant before the meeting began. Add Daniel to the Helix travel registry, she said. He'll be joining all international delegations moving forward. Her assistant hesitated. As a driver or a translator? Claire looked up at Daniel across the room, already reviewing notes in French for the day's session. As a consultant, she said. When the call ended, Daniel looked up, curious. Everything all right? She smiled. Better than all right. Let's go save a company, he chuckled softly. After you, Ms. Monroe. They walked into the conference room together, not as boss and driver, but as equals in purpose. 2 people who had found something far greater than a deal. Respect. The final day of negotiations arrived with a stillness that felt heavy with anticipation. The rain had cleared, leaving the sky pale and bright over Geneva. Inside the glass-walled conference room, everyone took their seats for what would decide months of work and billions of dollars. Claire sat at the head of the table, her usual edge replaced by quiet focus. To her right sat Daniel, dressed in the same grey suit he'd worn all week, calm and steady as ever. Across from them, Lucas and his Swiss team reviewed the final documents, their conversation switching fluidly between French and German. It was Daniel who caught the small misunderstanding first. A phrase in the contract, translated incorrectly by the initial legal team, implied shared liability instead of shared oversight. It was a single word, but it would have cost Helix hundreds of millions if left uncorrected. Daniel leaned toward Claire and whispered, "The French version says responsabilité conjointe. It should be supervision conjointe. The first means they can hold you accountable for their errors." Claire frowned, scanning the line. "Good catch," she said quietly. She addressed Lucas immediately. "Before we proceed, there's an issue in the French draft. It changes the meaning of Clause 14. Daniel caught it. Lucas looked up, slightly surprised. "He's right," he said after a moment. "That's an important distinction." "Thank you," Daniel nodded respectfully. "Just trying to keep both sides protected." That moment shifted everything. The Swiss lawyers looked at him differently now, not as an assistant or interpreter, but as someone who understood their language and their integrity. The meeting continued for hours, each point carefully reviewed, debated, and resolved. Every time communication threatened to slip, Daniel guided it back with patience and precision. His fluency didn't just smooth words, it softened egos. By late afternoon, Lucas closed his folder and smiled. "I believe we have an agreement." Applause filled the room. The tension that had built over days dissolved in a wave of relief. Claire stood, shaking hands with Lucas and his team. Cameras flashed as executives from both sides signed the final documents. Reporters, invited by the Swiss company, began taking notes and asking questions. Claire answered a few before one of them asked, "Ms. Munro, how did Helix turn the negotiation around after such a difficult start?" She glanced toward Daniel, who stood quietly by the wall trying to stay out of the frame. Then she smiled. "Teamwork," she said, "and listening to the right people, even when they're not the ones you expect." The reporters turned, curious. One of them asked, "Who's that gentleman beside you?" "He seems to have been crucial in the talks." Claire gestured for Daniel to step closer. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "This is Daniel Mensa," she said proudly. "He's been part of Helix longer than most of us realized. He helped bridge more than just language today. He bridged understanding." The room went quiet for a beat. Then applause rose again, genuine this time. Lucas shook Daniel's hand firmly. "You saved this deal," he said. "Not just with words, but with grace." Daniel smiled. "Thank you, sir." After the room cleared, Claire turned to him. "You just saved $1 billion. That's not something that happens every day." He laughed softly. "I'm glad I could help." "You did more than help," she said. "You reminded me that leadership isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who listens best." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Maybe you always knew that. You just needed a reminder," she smiled. "You're generous." He shrugged lightly. "Just honest." That evening, Helix hosted a small dinner to celebrate. The Swiss partners attended, the atmosphere warm and easy. Claire sat at the center of the long table, but she made sure Daniel was seated beside her, not as staff, but as part of the leadership team. Throughout the night, he spoke easily in different languages as the guests switched between French, Italian, and English. The transitions were seamless. Every time someone complimented Claire on her composure or vision, she deflected it toward him. "Daniel deserves more credit than anyone here," she said. "He taught us that intelligence isn't measured by titles." When the dinner ended, she pulled him aside near the hotel entrance. "Daniel, I meant what I said. You've got a place at Helix, an official one. I'll have HR draft an offer next week. Consultant of International Relations." He smiled gently. "I appreciate that, Ms. Munro. You've earned it," she said. "And call me Claire, please," he chuckled. "Then thank you, Claire. But I have to think about it." She frowned, surprised. "You don't want to stay?" "I didn't say that," he replied. "But sometimes helping isn't about moving up. It's about moving right toward balance. I'll let you know, she nodded slowly. Whatever you decide, you've got my respect, he smiled. That's enough for me. The next morning, Claire stood in the hotel lobby watching as Daniel loaded her luggage into the same black sedan. He still insisted on driving her to the airport. It felt full circle, but different now. When she stepped into the car, she said quietly, "Funny how things change." He looked at her through the mirror. Or maybe how people do. They drove in comfortable silence toward the airport. The city passed by in calm rhythm. Trams, trees, the soft reflection of morning light on the glass buildings. As they neared the terminal, she said, "You know, I thought I was saving Helix this week. Turns out you were saving me." He smiled faintly. "Maybe we saved each other." When they reached the departure gate, she stepped out and turned to him. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." He nodded once. "Safe travels, Claire." She paused before walking away. "You're not invisible anymore. Just remember that." He smiled, holding her gaze for a brief moment. "Neither are you." She boarded her flight knowing she'd leave Geneva not just with a deal, but with a lesson she'd never forget. That respect, humility, and brilliance often wear quiet faces. And somewhere on the long drive back to the hotel, Daniel turned up the radio and switched through stations. English, French, Italian, Arabic, each voice familiar, each word a reminder of the beauty in understanding.